Welcome to Game Changers with Molly Fletcher, where we take you behind the scenes with peak performers to learn what makes them tick and discover how you can apply their lessons to your life. I'm your host, Molly Fletcher. Here's a big thought for today. If you have the power to change your habits, you have the power to change your life. In his New York Times bestseller, The Power of Habit, today's guest, Charles Duhigg, explains the science of habits. Why do habits exist, and how can they be changed? In our conversation, Charles shares a framework to help you create new habits and break the bad habits that aren't serving you. Our habits are the foundation of how we live our lives and do our work. Whether you want to exercise every day, lose weight, or be more productive, the key is understanding how habits work. Let's get right into it. Here's my conversation with Charles Duhigg. Charles, what a treat to have you on. Thank you so much in your busy world to take time for us and our listeners. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
So, your book, The Power of Habit, has changed, including mine, so many lives and so many people I know. Most of our listeners probably have read it, but for those who maybe haven't, Charles, can you just touch really quickly on the big takeaway?
Sure. So the idea behind The Power of Habit is it's essentially an exploration of what we know about the science and neurology of habit formation, because we're kind of living through this golden age of understanding how habits exist within our brain. And I think the big insight is that we tend to think of habits as sort of one thing, but they're actually three things, right? What we know from a neurological perspective is that every habit has three components. There's a cue, which is like a trigger for an automatic behavior to start, and then a routine, which is the behavior itself, and then finally a reward. And that reward is why our brain learns to remember that pattern for the future. And so what we know is that when people spend time to diagnose the cues and the rewards that drive their behaviors, that it tends to make change much, much easier.
What I find so interesting, Charles, is you talk about how more than 40% of the actions we perform each day aren't really decisions at all, but they're habits. So why are habits so powerfully ingrained in all of us? I mean, that's a big number.
Well, the reason why is because our brain exists to make habits, right? There's a part of our brain that every animal has known as the basal ganglia. And the basal ganglia in large part exists simply to create habits. And the reason why is because without habits, we frankly never would have evolved, right? If you had to decide kind of anew what to eat for every single meal, or remember how to walk every single time you got out of a chair, you would never have time to do all the things that are important, right? So like invent, fire or aircraft carriers or video games. And so
Sure.
what it does is it's developed this collection of neurological material known as the basal ganglia that essentially exists to recognize behaviors and rewards and relate them to triggers. So that when a pattern in our life becomes common, when it delivers a consistent reward, our brain says, look, I'm going to take that and I'm going to make it into a chunk. And I'm going to allow that to happen without you having to think about it. Now, a habit is basically a decision that you made at some point that becomes automatic over time, something that you thought about at first and then you continue doing without thinking about it. And it's incredibly important to have that. There's good and bad habits in every single person's life every single day. And the key is that once you're able to recognize them and understand what the triggers and the cues and the rewards are better, then you have more power over influencing them.
So how would people go about changing a bad habit? So many of us have bad habits. Give me an example of how that works.
Well, so what's a bad habit you have?
I bite my nails.
Okay.
I bite my nails.
So nail biting is actually a pretty well set habit. And what do you find is going on when you bite your nails? I imagine that you don't sort of consciously decide to do it, that you just sort of find that your fingers are in your mouth all of a sudden?
To your point, I think it is very unconscious. I really do. I don't notice it. And then I look down and my nails aren't as long and pretty as they ought to be.
So what's going on when you end up biting your nails? Like what are you feeling or thinking about at those moments?
The obvious answer is I'm stressed about something or anxious about something, but I think I do it even when I'm not.
Yeah.
That's just my gut.
So what we know from studies is that most people, the cue for most people when they bite their nails is some type of tension. Now that tension can be anxiety, right? You're worried about something that's coming up. It can also be boredom. Oftentimes boredom is a form of tension. And so that becomes a cue for people that when they feel that slight tension, they put their hands into their mouths and they start biting their nails. So as researchers figured that out, then the next question became like, okay, so what's the reward there, right? Like why on earth do people keep doing this habit? What reward is it delivering? Well, as they started looking at it, what they realized is that when people bite their nails, and you know this because you do it, when people bite their nails, oftentimes it's a little painful, right? There's like this little moment of pain when someone bites their nails, particularly if the nail's already kind of been chewed down. And what's interesting is that pain sensation actually occurs in the same part of your brain as where the tension from anxiety or boredom exists. And pain is so overwhelming that it actually crowds out the tension of anxiety or boredom. And so what researchers realized was that the thing that people were doing is that they were actually using pain as a reward. Our brain actually prefers pain to tension.
Interesting.
And so if it can find something that delivers tension, it gives us a slight relief from that tension by crowding out the sensation of boredom or anxiety. Even if it's something unpleasant like pain, that pain becomes a reward that people will come to rely on. And so we have the cue, right, which is the tension of boredom or anxiety. We have the routine, which is biting your nails, and then we have the reward, which is this pain sensation, and the split-second sense of relief it gives us by crowding out the anxiety. And that's all that it takes for that to become a habit. So then the question becomes, okay, so how do you overcome that, right? What do you do in order to stop that habit? Well, there's basically two steps, and this is known as simplified habit reversal therapy. And actually, nail biting is one of the ways that it's been most studied. Is the first thing that you do is you have to make yourself aware of the cues. And so what they'll tell people who have nail biting problems is, look, carry around an index card, and for the next week, every time you feel the urge to bite your nails, just make a check on your index card. Right? Just pay attention to what's going on. What we're trying to do is we're just simply trying to make you cognizant or recognize some of the cues that are setting off your nail biting. And within a day or two, you're going to start noticing some patterns, right? Oh, I always bite my nails when I'm sitting at my desk. That's when I've been pulling out that card and making checks. Or it's when I'm talking to my mother, right? Or whatever it is. You're going to figure out what the patterns are, what the cues are, and those cues are going to become more obvious to you. Then what the researchers say is, okay, look, now for the next week, keep that same card. When you feel the urge to make a check, pull it out. When you feel an urge to bite your nails, pull out the card, make a check. And then instead of biting your nails, just rub your arm kind of hard, right? Like just, scratch your arm a little bit. Just, not leaving a mark or anything, but some physical sensation, some kind of intense, not necessarily pain, but some kind of physical sensation. And then put a check mark on your card to show that instead of biting your nails, you rubbed your arm. And what they find is that when you begin relocating that behavior to something else besides biting your nails, something that gives you a similarly physical sensation and kind of distracts you from the anxiety or the boredom, that what it does is it starts to change that habit. And the thing about habits is they're very, very delicate, right? Like all you need to do is really shift the pieces a little bit and they kind of collapse. And if people do that for about a week, they end up not biting their nails anymore. The idea there is that basically once you start to recognize the cues and the rewards, once you diagnose what's driving this behavior, it gives you a lot more control over changing that behavior.
Right, absolutely. And one of the things you talk about is for a habit to stay changed, that people must believe that change is really possible. And so how can people cultivate that belief to make that change sustainable?
I think that the first way is to just to seek out small wins, right? There's a thing known as the science of small wins that shows that when people have small little victories, right, it gives them sometimes irrational belief in their capacity to have bigger victories. So if you look at many public health campaigns, they oftentimes start with a very, very small campaign that has a very modest outcome. But it convinces people that bigger changes are possible. And once they believe the bigger changes are possible, those bigger changes, in fact, become not only possible, but more likely. And so if someone, for instance, wants to start an exercise routine, or an exercise habit, the thing is, like, at first, don't go for a 5-mile run, right? On your first day, literally wake up, put on your running clothes, walk downstairs, and then walk back upstairs.
Absolutely.
And then the next day, put on your running clothes, go outside, take a block, go for a 1-block walk around the house, around the block, right? The point is that very frequently what's going to happen is that a number of the mental blocks that prevent us from doing something, they'll sort of fade into nothingness because we have this pattern that we can look at. That, I used to be someone who didn't exercise, and now I've spent 2 weeks and I've walked around the block 12 times. And one day I actually walked 2 blocks. And then you start to sort of feel like, well, if I can do that, I could probably run half a mile. And then once you run half a mile, you're like, well, if I could run half a mile, I could probably run a mile. And that's kind of how you start exercising.
In just a minute, we'll get back to today's show. But first, I want to share with you some exciting news. My new book, The Energy Clock, is hot off the press and available for pre-order now. Do you feel like you're always running low on energy? Do you find yourself giving your energy to the wrong people and the wrong things? Then pick up The Energy Clock and take control of your most important resource, your energy. In it, I show you how to start giving more of yourself to what's most important and how to stop wasting your time and resources on what's not. The Energy Clock hits stores on January 1, and you can pre-order it today. Visit theenergyclock.com for more information. I want to talk about the second part of the book is about habits at the organizational level. What are some keystone habits? Like how can you identify them, and how do they transform organizations?
One of the things that we know is that organizations have habits the same way individuals do, right? And they follow a simple pattern that oftentimes a company or a group, that there will be some cue that triggers a behavior, and then once that behavior starts, it's usually delivering rewards. And so for many companies, the key is to try and identify what are those cues and rewards that are causing us to, for instance, CC everyone on emails, or to have meetings that start late or that go too long. And the key is that all of those are definitely rewarding someone, right? Those behaviors don't exist because sort of randomly. They exist because even if they're not great behaviors, even if they're not the most productive behaviors, somebody is benefiting from them somehow. And once you identify who is benefiting, it gives you the ability to change that behavior into something healthier.
So it's the same model of sorts, just at the organizational level. So it's recognizing the cue, recognizing the routine that exists, the reward, and sort of that habit loop that you talk about.
That's exactly right. And acknowledging that if you have an organizational habit within your company, something that's happening that people feel like ought to change, the reason it exists is because somebody is getting a reward from it somewhere. And unless you find some new way to deliver that old reward, unless you find some healthier behavior that delivers something similar to that old reward, then things aren't really going to change.
Charles, I want to switch to Smarter, Faster, Better, your latest book. What's the difference between being busy and being productive? It sounds obvious to so many of us, but how do you define productivity?
Well, for a long time, being busy and being productive were somewhat synonymous, right? Until probably about the 1970s or 80s, the more time you spent at work probably meant the more work you got done. But then with the rise, particularly of computer technologies, we all now know that you could spend an entire day replying to emails and get nothing important done that day. And so I think that's the real distinction, is to help people recognize that the way that you think about your time and the way that you think about your work is as important as the work you actually do and how you spend that time. That being able to distinguish which goals are most impactful, being able to sort of prompt innovation when it's most needed, rather than having to wait for a brainstorm to occur. Those are the things that make us productive rather than just busy. And that we know that there's a lot of tricks or tools available to us that allow us to get that done. One of my favorite examples is just the to-do list. There's lots of people who write to-do lists. And if you look at the research on them, what you'll find is that the most productive people, they tend not to have very long to-do lists, right? So there's a memory aid. Like, it's fine to have a long to-do list where you store things on a piece of paper rather than trying to store them on your memory. I think everyone does that. But that's not what a to-do list should be. That's just a memory aid. What a to-do list should be is it should have three things on it. It should have the most important thing to get done today, the second most important thing to get done today if you get the first one done, and what you think the most important thing to work on tomorrow is. And you should write that to-do list afresh every single morning, because what is important will change from day to day. And if you're spending your time simply looking for the easiest thing on your to-do list to do so you can check it off and feel good about that, then you're not really being productive, right? A to-do list should not be a memory device. A to-do list should be a prioritization device. And so the most productive people, they tend to have a to-do list that's completely separate from their memory aid. And that to-do list tends to be very, very short so that it forces them to focus on what's most important.
So focus and clarity are key. Got it. Okay. You devote a section of the book to motivation, which I love. And one of the key points I took away from that is that to motivate others, that you must feel like, we're in control. So for leaders to feel like they're in control, how can we take control? Like, talk to me about that a little bit. That's interesting.
Well, I think that what we know about generating motivation is that oftentimes motivation comes from taking a chore and making it into a choice, right? When we can find some locus of control in that activity, it helps us motivate in order to get it done. So, and then I think tying that to our deep held values and aspirations is another critical part of that. So one professor I talked to, he said that when he would grade students' papers, which he hated doing, that he would always sort of have this mantra he would tell himself, which is, if I grade these students' papers, then I'm bringing in money to the university. And if I'm bringing in money to the university, they can fund my research. And if they're funding my research, then I'm going to be able to cure cancer. And so by grading these students' papers, I'm helping to cure cancer, which made it much easier for him to motivate to grade those students' papers. I think that's key, is that when people find some way to identify a locus of control in the activity that they're doing, it really helps. Let's just talk a little bit about how to, so we can let your listeners know about it.
Please.
So I have a new podcast with Slate that's called How To with Charles Duhigg. And the idea behind it is that we have, every week someone contacts us and they say, I have a particular problem. I want to figure out how to. We had a pastor from Oklahoma call us who wanted to learn how to be funnier from the pulpit. And so what we did is we paired him. We found an expert, this professional comedian named Gary Goldman, to give him advice on how to write the perfect joke. Just another one that we had is that we had a guy in Bozeman, Montana, who owns a company, and small company, and he was trying to figure out how to fire one of his employees because he's really conflict averse. And so we got a professor from Stanford Business School to give him advice. This is how you fire someone. This is the right way to do it, so that you're being as kind as you can for the employee, and also you're being as kind as you can to yourself, because this person needs to go. And so the idea behind the show is that each week we have someone, a caller, who has a problem, and then we find an expert through investigative reporting to give them advice and help solve their problem, and then we see how it goes. And if anyone has problems they're dealing with, I'd love to hear from them. They can just send their problem to howto@slate.com. So just HOWT at slate.com. And I'd love to invite your listeners to subscribe to the show. They can find it on iTunes by typing in How To or my name, Charles Duhigg.
And Charles, do you lay over top any of the sort of this? I'm sure you weave in Smarter, Faster, Better and the Power of Habits as a part of helping make this shift?
Yes, absolutely. We try and take advantage of all the advances in science and psychology and behavioral sciences and neurology to help people learn how to live better lives.
I have to ask you, Charles, what's a habit that's transformed your life?
I'd say exercise. One of the things that I learned while I was researching the book was that for many people, exercise becomes a sort of keystone habit, right? Something that organizes their life in a very powerful way. And I started exercising more. I just running like 2 or 3 miles in the morning. and it's had a huge impact on me. It's made me more productive. It's made me happier. It's a great Keystone habit to have.
So, Charles, we end with rapid fire. I'm going to fire a question, and you just fire what comes up.
Okay.
One bad habit you haven't replaced yet.
I still have desserts.
The best advice you've ever received.
Oh gosh, I don't know. I guess just to try and do the things that I enjoy the most.
The show's called Game Changers. One last question. What game changer inspires you and why?
There's an academic named David Bryan Davidson who recently passed away, who was a professor of mine when I was in college. And he wrote a great deal about the American South and slavery. And he really brought a very data-driven and very intellectually rigorous way of looking at the question of slavery and the costs that it had not only on African-American populations and African populations, but also on American and white America. And so I look to his example of intellectual honesty quite a bit when I think about my own work.
That's fantastic. So How To with Charles Duhigg. We all got to check that out. Charles, thanks so much for your time. Super grateful.
Thank you.
Thanks, as always, for listening to Game Changers with Molly Fletcher. If you like the show, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts. There you can listen to previous episodes and leave us a review, which helps other people find out about the show. For more about me, visit mollyfletcher.com. Until next time, stay curious and be bold.